Hello and welcome to our latest webinar with equine reproduction specialist Jonathan Pycock. Today's webinar will be on preventing early pregnancy failure in your practice. As this is a pre-recorded webinar, any questions you have for John can be submitted to hello@imv-imaging.com. I will now hand over to John to begin his presentation.
Greetings, everybody. Today we're going to talk about preventing early pregnancy failure in your practice. Since we're mentioning your practice, here's a slide of my own practice, now grown to 6 of us. You can see from me there in the suit, I'm mainly just sat at a desk these days. But over the years at Equine Reproductive Services, we think we've come up with a very good way of minimizing losses from early pregnancy failure, and that really is what I'd like to share with you today, is how we do that and hopefully transmit that into how you may be able to do that in your own practice. Of course, we haven't an awful lot of time in this webinar, so there are a number of books available on the topic. In particular, Current Therapy in Equine Reproduction has 3 or 4 chapters around the topic of early pregnancy failure. So they'd be well worth a read to get some more detail. Likewise, the Equine Reproduction double volume has some good information, and a relatively recent book, Atlas of Equine Ultrasonography. I did the chapter on that. So you'll find some useful information in those textbooks, which we can't cover in the short time available to us today. So let's start off with a little question. Which statement is false? I'm going to make 4 statements and I want you to have a think about which one is false. So early pregnancy rates in the mare have increased in the last 20 years. Less mares lose the early pregnancy now compared with 20 years ago. Live foal rates have increased in the last 20 years. The same number of mares lose the early pregnancy now compared with 20 years ago. Well, the answer really is 4. We could have a little bit of a debate whether we are seeing marginally less early pregnancy failure in the mare than we were 20 years ago. But nonetheless, I think the point remains that early pregnancy rates have dramatically increased in the last 20 years. Live foal rates have increased in the last 20 years. But we really haven't done very much about dealing with mares which lose the early pregnancy. And that's why I think this is such an important and fascinating topic to talk about. So that leads us into the fact that, without any shadow of doubt, early pregnancy failure is a major source of economic loss to the horse breeding industry. What do we know about fertilization rates in the mare? High. I mean, we don't know for sure, but let's say they're certainly above 90%. What we do know is that older mares may have oocyte problems, which clearly are going to impact negatively on fertilization rate. But of course, the real incidence of early pregnancy failure before day 6 and the descent of the conceptors into the uterine environment, we don't truthfully know. So we're a little bit in the dark on that. So when you see this explained in a textbook, most colleagues or book chapters will talk about pregnancy failure as being the loss between days 14 and 36. We pick those because if you remember back to when we normally scan mares for pregnancy, we typically do the first scan around 14 days and often do the 3rd scan around 33, 34, 35, something like that. So we normally talk about early pregnancy failure couched in terms of between days 14 and 36. And estimates of that vary quite enormously, really, from 8 through to 20%. And possibly the key figure is age of the mare. Clearly, as the mare becomes older, more will go on to lose the early pregnancy. That's a fact, and we can minimize it, which is what we're going to talk about. But we cannot get away from the fact that older mares are more likely to lose the early pregnancy. And as I say, that's written up in quite extensive detail in chapter 55 of Current Therapy in Equine Reproduction, with a chapter by Dirk van der Waal and Johnny Newcomb. In practice, it's very, very important for you, particularly if you're dealing with clients who are either new to breeding or relatively inexperienced in breeding, stress to them the fact that the first pregnancy scan we do around 14 days is really connected with twin management, etc. And it certainly can't be taken as a guarantee that 11 months on or 10 months, 3 weeks on, that mare will go on to produce a live, healthy foal. So it doesn't happen, of course, in the big thoroughbred or big AI stations where managers know mares have to have several scans. But do remember, if you're going to deal with new breeders, you may have to spend some time explaining to them why they need more than one pregnancy scan. And it's really connected with the fact that in the horse, we're scanning mares for pregnancy relatively early, simply 14 days from when they ovulated. Possibly we don't do very well at preventing early pregnancy failure because we know there are many causes and they're relatively poorly understood. In a book chapter, this was written, our belief is that persistent, unidentified or poorly treated acute and chronic inflammatory conditions of the uterus are responsible for the majority of problems of early pregnancy failure. Now, what's that statement saying? It's really saying if we don't sort the uterine environment out by the time that conceptus descends into the uterus, 5.5 to 6 days, well, that's going to be largely why the mare will undergo early pregnancy failure. Now, do we agree with that statement? Do you think that's a good statement or not? Well, I guess I've got to nail my colour to the mast, as it were, to use an expression, because it was actually me who said it, along with Angus McKinnon, my old chum there down at the bottom, and Juan Sampa, some of you may recognise as well. We said that in chapter 57 of the book. So I certainly do believe that, and clearly Angus McKinnon believes that, and we'll leave that one with you. I think you've got to, what is that saying? It's saying you've really got to pay attention to your breeding of the mare, your post-breeding management of the mare. You know, once you've decided the mare is not going to go in foal unless you cover or inseminate her, you know, simple as that sounds, it is a fact. And a lot of determining whether or not that pregnancy will go on to term depends on breeding management of that uterine environment. And, you know, that's uterine lavage plus or minus oxytocin and other treatments, which we've talked about in a webinar previously. These would be the mares. You know, this mare is likely to develop a persistent breeding-induced endometritis. She's got very poor vulval shape. She may have a saggy uterus. I can't remember how old this mare was, but she was probably a mid to late teenage mare. She's had a lot of foals before. The uterus is maybe quite pendulous. That mare is at risk for persistent breeding-induced endometritis. And if you don't pay a lot of attention to that uterine environment of mares like these after breeding, well, that pregnancy is ultimately going to fail. So I said a couple of slides back, the causes are multifactorial. We can put them perhaps usefully into headings. So genetic, defects arising at fertilization, chromosome abnormalities and aged oocytes, environmental problems, the uterine environment, which, as we said, I feel is so very, very important. And endocrine problems. The endocrinology of pregnancy in the mare is complex, and that leads us into what we're going to talk about in the second half, the so-called progesterone dilemma. Do we supplement mares in early pregnancy with progesterone or not? And we'll spend some time talking about that. Again, let's refer you to Current Therapy, good chapter on early embryonic loss, and that will explore some of the potential factors we think are involved in early pregnancy. I can't lead you through all the recent literature that's happened, but I do just want to flag up a very recent paper, 2020. Whole genome analysis reveals aneuploidies. Just to remind you or point out, an aneuploidy is a gain or loss of a whole chromosome, are involved in equine early pregnancy failure. And it's work like this which is going to be helpful because, as this paper itself says, equine early pregnancy failure has no diagnosis in over 80% of cases. And I don't want to blow our own trumpet, as it were, but if you see there, it's very nice to have James Crabtree, so a practitioner, a good colleague and friend of mine who took over the running of our practice, getting a paper in Nature from equine veterinary practice. So that's just to encourage those of you out there to do record your data, publish things, and it contributes a lot to the literature. So I'd refer you to that paper. We can't go through it in any kind of detail here. We can, of course, detect early pregnancy failure with ultrasound, and I talked about this at length in the webinar on detection of early pregnancy, and made the point that a small for age conceptus may indicate it's undergoing pregnancy failure, but of course it may well be simply that the ovulation which led to this conceptus on the right occurred 24 hours after the ovulation, which led to the conceptus on the left. So while small for age can indicate early pregnancy failure, you've got to have been accurate in your follicle detection so you can know and precisely when each follicle ovulated, so you actually can assign a number of days from ovulation to each conceptus. And if this is a day 15 conceptus and this is a day 14, they're small for age. That is on the right is perfectly normal for a day 14 days from ovulation. The other crucial fact we think in our practice is when the embryo itself, not the conceptus, the embryo itself fails to appear. And certainly in our practice, where we can be quite accurate, we hope, in our follicle detection, once we have a mare which we know is more than 24 days from a known ovulation and no embryo has appeared, we prostaglandin that mare, because ultimately that pregnancy will fail. If the embryo has not appeared by day 24, now, if you're going to do this, you've got to be accurate with your follicle evaluation, and you've got to know it's a day 24. So you've probably got to be examining these mares on a daily basis, otherwise, around the time of ovulation. Otherwise, you know, you can't determine ovulation that accurately. And this is quite a big decision to make. But over many years, we've monitored these pregnancies. And when the embryo itself has failed to appear by day 24, well, even if it subsequently appears, that pregnancy will not go on to develop normally. What have we got here in this ultrasound image? Well, we can see a mare 14 days from ovulation. She was covered and then ovulated 14 days ago. And there we can see a 14-day conceptus, all well and good. What, unfortunately, is that 14-day conceptus surrounded by? Well, it looks like pretty echogenic fluid to me, and generally, not always, we know, but generally echogenic fluid, the more particulate a fluid is, the more likely it has to have inflammatory components in it. So it looks to me like that 14-day conceptus is surrounded by a whole bunch of uterine exudate. So if you scan this mare at 14 days, and saw that pregnancy, are you happy about it, not happy about it? What are you going to do about it? Well, you could treat it. Some people may try treating with antibiotics and progestogens, give the mare prostaglandin and start again, or do nothing. I've picked an extreme here, and rather than run through what we would do with this mare, let me show you the next slide, which is a similar picture, a little bit of a, it's the same 14, not the same, but it's another 14, 15-day conceptus. It's a slightly bigger scale, that's all. And the point being here, we've also got fluid round the conceptus, but it's much smaller in amount and it's not as echogenic. What a contrast. I think this mare, it's worth trying some therapy to try and save, rescue, whatever you want to call it, that pregnancy. The first mare, if we can hopefully just go back, too far gone. I mean, you're not going to save that pregnancy. That's game over for that mare. But this mare, certainly if you treat these mares we would put them on antibiotics and altrenogest, progestogen, prostaglandin, you know, we wouldn't do that. We would try and save them, and we wouldn't do nothing. So we would very much treat these mares with antibiotics and altrenogest. How long do we keep the mare on the antibiotics? Well, probably 5 days, or until we've seen that fluid, you know, the fluid pocket surrounding the conceptus disappearing. How long do we keep the mare on progesterone, or progestogen, I should say, to be accurate? Well, we'll talk about progestogen in the last part of the talk, so we'll deal with that then. Early pregnancy failure. What do we think then? So we've dealt with a mare with a lot of fluid around the early pregnancy and said how we're likely to lose that. We've considered the mare with a small pocket of fluid, free fluid around the early conceptus, and said we might be able to save that pregnancy with appropriate treatment. Now, if we go one step further back still, the mare which has not developed any free fluid at all in the uterus, but does have a marked edema pattern, i.e. fluid within the endometrium, do we like to see that at the first pregnancy scan? Well, it's not a very good expression, really, is it? Do we, in inverted commas, like to see it? What I could perhaps better explain is, you know, I'm comfortable if I do a 14-15 day scan, as in this top right picture, and there's a degree of uterine edema around about that septus, but it isn't widespread up the left horn or right horn and in the uterine body. Once we start getting no sign of the conceptus at all, but a uterine edema pattern elsewhere within the uterus, I don't think that's as, you know, I'm not as comfortable with that. That to me could indicate that mare is undergoing early pregnancy failure. And particularly if we see widespread edema pattern in the uterine body of a mare at 14-15 days pregnancy, that is a concern to me. What will I do? Well, what I'll certainly do is go on to the ovary and have a look at the corpus luteum, and I'd like to see a very obvious ultrasonically detectable corpus luteum. We've done a lot of work over the years, and we'll touch on that when we talk about progesterone again, but there's no doubt that if the corpus luteum is readily visible, it's much more likely to be pushing out a decent amount of progesterone. So if you see these mares red edema pattern, go on to left and right ovary and have a good look to evaluate and make a decision about the corpus luteum. And you may decide you're going to have to supplement the mare with progestogen, and that's what we're going to talk about last. Just before we get into the progesterone story, I want to share something else with you. And this is a subject that's been of great interest to me over the last 20 years in practice, studying the advantage of using a GnRH agonist, buserelin, in prevention of early pregnancy failure. Now, it's back along, I think 1990, I can't remember exactly. I will bring the paper up, but I think it's around about 20 years ago now that we were first approached by Intervet, as it was then, on the back of a number of papers which show that in cattle, seems to have been particularly done in dairy cattle, but having talked to bovine veterinarians, it's across the board. Several studies have shown that during the late luteal phase, if you inject GnRH agonist, buserelin, you'll get an increase in pregnancy rate. And that's pretty well documented in the literature. But the mechanism was never really, and to the best of my knowledge, and periodically I get the opportunity to chat this through with bovine practitioners, and they reassure me that it still is the case. The mechanism really isn't known. When the data started being published about the improvement in pregnancy rate, The studies seem to suggest that it either inhibited luteolysis, which seems rational, or it stimulated luteal function, which again seemed rational. So one would have to imagine if we're getting an improvement in pregnancy rate, well, it must be doing one or the other or some kind of combination of both of these. So it was against that background that we were asked to do a study to see if a single injection of buserelin in the late luteal phase could improve pregnancy rates in mares. And we published this in Theriogenology a little bit over, yes, gosh, 24 years probably now. Time flies. And again, I'll refer you to that paper. You can generally go and get these online. There's the reference for you. A reasonably sized trial, nearly 600 mares, looking at a single intramuscular treatment of buserelin on pregnancy rates. Now, as I say, those of you who are particularly interested, go and find the paper. I'm just going to summarize the results here. What we found was that buserelin did increase the pregnancy rate after breeding at the first estrus, and it increased the maintenance of pregnancy rates between days 28 and 30. But it's a relatively small effect, in all honesty. It's not a huge percentage. It's 3 or 4 or 5 percentage points increasing the pregnancy rate. So use of buserelin has not become widespread, possibly outside our practice. I know some colleagues use it, but it certainly couldn't be described as used widespread. It is in our practice, and we think, and nothing over the last 30 years since that paper by now almost has changed our mind on it. We believe it's helpful in reducing early pregnancy failure, but it's relatively small percentage until, and this is what I want to make this point here. Once you get onto second and third cycles, what do we mean by that? Well, if you breed a mare and you scan her and she's not in foal, that's not good. And it's roundabout, most of us in equine reproductive practice like to think about a per cycle pregnancy rate of 65%, hopefully a bit more, but let's go with 2/3. 2 out of 3 mares should be in foal the first time you cover them. That's our sort of expectation, possibly a little bit above, depending on your breeding system, age of mares, of course, and all that, all those factors. The minute you go to second and third cycles, well, you clearly have begun to select, for whatever reason, for a mare that is not, you know, you could describe as a problem breeder. And the minute you use buserelin in second and third cycles, then you see a much greater percentage increase in pregnancy rates compared with the increase we saw in using buserelin at the first cycle. My conclusion from that is that pregnancy failure or failure to detect a mare in foal at 14 to 15 days, a good number of those mares have undergone early pregnancy failure. And that's the explanation of why, once we use it in second and third cycles, we see this bigger percentage point increase in pregnancy rate. We have had some support from it. This was a Therio paper in 2002 out of Germany. And if you get hold of that paper, it does provide some support for pregnancy rate being increased after application of GnRH in mares. I only did that one study with Johnny Newcomb back in 1995, published in 96. But John's continued to look at this subject over many years, building up into very, very impressive numbers, and remains convinced that buserelin does significantly increase pregnancy rates. And even more recently still, John Newcomb and Andy Peters drew all this work about buserelin together across the species, trying to present a working theory as to how treatment with GnRH analog buserelin does in fact decrease early pregnancy failure. So for those of you who want to delve into the subject in detail, I'd certainly refer you to that excellent review article. So to cut to how we use it in our practice, Well, any mare with a history of early pregnancy failure or a likely candidate. What do I mean by that? Well, a mare which last year lost the pregnancy somewhere along the line, or an aged mare, a mare with a poor vulval conformation, pooling fluid after breeding, etc., etc. That would be a likely candidate. And all mares, wherever possible, obviously it depends on the owner. We have to discuss it with them because it's got not enormous, but obviously modest financial implications. All mares on the second cycle onwards. So that's Buserelin. Let's finish with another controversial subject, progesterone. If ever you want to divide equine reproductive clinicians, it's whether or not we should use progesterone to prevent early pregnancy failure in mares. Let's start off with something non-controversial. Progesterone is, we can all agree, produced by the corpus luteum following ovulation. There's an early corpus luteum there. There's a more mature corpus luteum, I don't know, maybe day 8, 9, 10 of cycle. There's a rapid rise in progesterone after ovulation in the mare until levels decline when prostaglandin, as we know, is released from the uterus in the non-pregnant mare, and we get luteolysis. What we know, of course, is progesterone is the hormone of pregnancy. It prepares the uterus for pregnancy. And we can evaluate the corpus luteum, as I said, on ultrasound, and there's a collection of CLs. That's a very obvious corpus luteum there. We can get follicles at the early pregnancy scan. We don't mind seeing follicles at the early pregnancy scan. What we do mind is not being able to detect a corpus luteum. And that's why when we talk about pregnancy, very, very important to always evaluate the equine corpus luteum. So a number of us in practice use the progestogen. In the UK, we mainly use Altrenagest. Used to be just an oral preparation. More recently, we've got a compounder who will make it for us, Altrenagest, and we can inject it, which avoids handling the product. Use of the progestogen, Altrenagest. And these were the two options we use in our practice. Now, I'm well aware that the majority of scientific evidence suggests that primary luteal inadequacy is not the cause of reduced progesterone levels. I've read those papers too, folks, so I'm well aware of that. Let's park that for now. We probably can't, we're unlikely to ever come to a consensus on that, but let's just get it out there that I accept that. Let's go on to, if we are going to supplement progesterone, which we don't use native progesterone in the UK, I'm aware some countries do, we use a progestogen. At least we must use a progestogen that does raise progesterone levels in the horse. And we know that Altrenagest does that. Several of the other progestogens don't appear to bind to the equine progesterone receptor, so they are not going to raise progesterone levels. Now, the seminal paper, which is often quoted as sort of the background as to why we have this impression, or it's more than an impression, that changes in plasma progesterone are not involved in early pregnancy failure, probably came out of this large field study from Cliff Irvine and his colleagues, a senior figure in equine reproduction research, and they measured plasma progesterone concentrations in large numbers of mares, and they certainly couldn't determine that a reduction in progesterone levels caused early pregnancy failure. Since then, there have been clearly not those big, large field studies, but there have been numbers of papers looking at often individual mares where the mare has undergone premature luteal regression and the pregnancy has subsequently been maintained by the use of an oral Altrenagest. So this was a neat little paper in Equine Veterinary Journal I'd refer you to. And then I particularly like this review article. You could argue it's a little bit of a poison chalice Simon Stamfley got to try and look at this topic, because it's quite divisive, as we said. Do I give Altrenagest to prevent pregnancy failure? And I think Simon did an excellent job of reviewing the literature and looking at the pros and cons. And again, I'd recommend you all to go and read that article. It's readily available in Equine Veterinary Education. I'm just going to give you the conclusion Simon came to. Luteal insufficiency as a cause of early embryonic death in the mare is rare, and the widespread use of Altrenagest in mares that fail to conceive or carry a pregnancy to term is not evidence-based. However, in selected cases, aged mares after endotoxemia, iatrogenic luteolysis, embryo transfer, and twin reduction, or during placentitis, the use of Altrenagest has a positive effect on live foal rates compared to untreated controls. I think that's a neat conclusion to come to, and pretty unarguable with, I think. So I think that's a particularly interesting article to read. Now, I kind of am presenting this so I can tell you what we do, and you can decide to do it, not to do it. We're wrong, right? That's up to you. But I'm going to tell you what we do in our practice. Any mare with a history of early pregnancy failure, or a mare with a marked edema at the first pregnancy scan distributed throughout the uterus, or a mare with a poor quality corpus luteum at the first pregnancy scan, we will encourage that owner to put that mare on progestogen supplementation, either oral Regumate or injectable Altrenagest. Now, I'm hovering a little bit, not because I don't know what I'm going to say, because some of you may be a bit surprised at this, but I might as well be honest. And I'm not suggesting for a minute you need to do this, but this is what I ended up doing in practice. And if I just give you a minute or two to determine why I came up with this. Well, the whole subject of supplementing with progestogen or not in early pregnancy is a little bit equivocal. So because of that, it means there's not a hard and fast rule as to how you do it. So I might go out and say, well, yes, there's a lot of edema in this 14-day scan. Can't see a very good CL. I'd like this mare on progestogen therapy. We'll keep her on it till day 80. Then we'll go every other day. Then we'll go once a week. And then we'll stop around about 120, 130 days. Another colleague would go out and say something slightly different in terms of the number of days that mare should be supplemented with progestogen. And we were getting feedback with clients that, hey, you know, you say we should do it today 90, and Jimmy Crabtree says we should do it today 100, or vice versa, or whatever. That isn't the point. The point is that it was differing, and mare owners don't like that. They like a uniformity. So against that background, I came in one day to practice and I said, right, guys, we're going to standardize this approach. No great science to this, but this is what we're going to do. We're going to put the mare on it daily until day 100, every other day to day 120, twice weekly to day 140. I am well aware that that may well in many cases be an overkill, unnecessary. If you see a poor quality CL at day 14, just supplement the mare with progestogen till a secondary ovulation comes along and you've got a nice obvious CL. A lot of logic to that. Stop giving your progestogen. That's up to you in your practice. If you want to do that, I'm not going to knock that. But there's no point in me lying. I'm telling you what I do. So there it is. And we, in fact, used to, in the end, give the mare this information sheet. So when it left the stud, there was no doubt about what we were doing. And then a little bit there, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but if you think your mind back to that mare with that horrendous vulval shape, the very sloping vulva, we actually think those mares could be at risk from losing the foal due to infection getting in from the outside, which certainly in the UK and most countries is the biggest cause of later pregnancy failure and ascending placentitis getting in from the outside. And I originally got this idea from Angus McKinnon, I recollect, and we decided that it may be helpful in these mares to give a broad spectrum antibiotic which penetrates reasonably well into that environment. So we use oral trimodazine, oral trimethoprim sulfur, the first 5 days of the month, beginning after 60 days of pregnancy. Again, I know with the pressure we've got on antibiotic usage at the moment, that's something perhaps we've got to modify, and we've got to think very, very carefully about. I encourage everyone to be, we've got to be mindful, rightly so, of antibiotic usage. So it may be a little bit of an overkill, and perhaps we shouldn't be doing it as much these days. But nonetheless, that's the Mare information sheet we used to send out. And we'll draw to a halt there. Here's, I think 2 or 3 years ago, before Beaver Congress, I gathered up a bunch of my friends in the equine world who happened to be all expert equine reproductive clinicians, and we had a wonderful time at Congress. And before Congress began, we ran a course, a practical course down at, some of you may know, Tullis and Edward Matson's place in Shropshire. And we gathered up Big John Spencer, Dixon Varner, Wan Samper, Karen Wolfsdorf, don't know who that bloke is, and Jimmy Crabtree. So with that, I'll leave you with it. Early pregnancy failure in your practice, and hopefully you'll get a couple of little tips that you can go on to minimize it in your practice. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, John. Any questions that you have for John can be submitted to hello@imv-imaging.com. You will receive an email in the coming days with the full recording of the webinar. You will find previous webinars we have done on our website. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.